from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
Two major superpowers emerged from World War II. In the West, the United States had proved its power in World War II. Their military led the way fighting against the Axis. The men and women on the home front supplied the soldiers with all the goods necessary to win a war, and the people of the United States used their minds to develop new technology that would help lead them into the future. The other superpower emerged from the East, and that was the Soviet Union. They proved vital in the war, fighting off Adolf Hitler and closing down the Eastern Front. The Soviet Union was practicing a new type of government, communism, and they began to thrive in an attempt to prove their way of life. These two superpowers will butt heads for more than 40 years. Hostility from the Soviet Union grows. Truman decides to stop babying the Soviets. The United States adopts a policy of containment. This policy states that the United States would resist Soviet attempts to expand its power and spread communism to other free countries. The United States pledged military force and economic aid to countries who resisted Soviet advances. In March of 1947, Harry Truman issues the Truman Doctrine. Truman promised economic and military aid to countries threatened by communism. Over the next 3 years, the United States sent over $400 million to Greece and Turkey, keeping them democratic. The Truman Doctrine will dictate American foreign policy for the next 60 years, and even today.
The Truman Doctrine was a successful strategy, but more was needed to be done. The United States wanted to keep communism from spreading west throughout Europe. However, the US also wanted to avoid World War III with the Soviet Union, and was looking for alternatives. This leads to the Marshall Plan. In 1947, devastated by World War II, poverty and hunger plagued Western Europe. With agriculture and industry in ruins because of the war, poorer nations throughout Europe were more susceptible to communism because of the promise of equality that it gave them. When times get desperate, people tend to cling to radical ideas like communism. To prevent these poorer nations to turning to communism, Secretary of State George Marshall proposes the Marshall Plan in 1947. His plan would provide economic aid and supplies to all European nations who needed it. However, to qualify for this aid, nations had to openly pledge to resist communism. The plan was successful in helping to rebuild Western Europe after the war.
An area in which the Cold War almost got hot was in Berlin, and what was known as the Berlin Airlift. In June of 1948, Stalin closed all ground access into the democratic West Berlin. As Berlin lies entirely in the Soviet zone, they were able to shut down all roadways and railways. Stalin was furious at the idea of a Western government and economy sitting in the communist East Germany. Stalin hoped to starve West Berlin into submission. Using the codename Operation Vittles, the United States and England broke the Soviet blockade with the Berlin Airlift. This was a 327-day campaign where 277,000 flights dropped 2.3 million tons of supplies into West Berlin by air. The United States wanted to do whatever they could to supply the West and prove that democracy would last. With the Soviet Union intentionally harming the citizens of West Berlin, it was a public relations nightmare, and eventually, the Soviets lifted the blockade, proving a victory for the West.
After the Berlin Airlift, the United States and our allies were concerned about a potential war with the Soviet Union, as Stalin became more bold and more daring. In 1949, to protect against future Soviet aggression, the West forms the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also known as NATO. NATO is a defensive alliance that was formed by 12 original member nations. NATO exists still today and is much bigger. This defensive alliance would pledge military support and collective defense in case of a Soviet attack. If the Soviet Union or her satellite nations were to attack any Western member of NATO, all member nations of NATO would pledge military support against the attack. The West hoped that the prospect of fighting so many member nations at once would deter Stalin from any future aggression and would help to prevent a future world war between the two superpowers.